Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Jay Joshi of MD Angels. Jay, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Hall. Appreciate it.
Great. Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got into early stage investing?
Sure. I'm a physician by training. I did my undergrad and medical school together in an accelerated medical program. And while I was in medical school, I realized that I look at medicine a little bit more differently than the traditional physician. Not to say that it's a better or worse thing, but I felt like my perspective was different. And I thought that that perspective would materialize more into hospital administration. So I ended up getting my MBA at Chicago Booth in between my medical school and my residency. But what I found out was when I was in residency, I had a risk pension that was a little bit more entrepreneurial and venture oriented as opposed to the more risk averse nature that you'll see in healthcare. And lo and behold, I came up with my first startup concept, which is a medical device company. And as I was looking for investors for my medical device company, I realized that a lot of the investors in the Midwest felt that a pre-revenue medical device company was too high a risk. So I gravitated towards physicians. But what I found was in the investment community, physicians are often a disparate group of investors that don't necessarily have the necessary cohesion that's needed in order to make the right decisions. And so along with some of the physician investors who came in on my medical device company, Output Medical, we ended up creating now what has become the largest physician-based angel investment group in the Midwest, MD Angels. And that's really kind of how I got into the space. It was kind of a series of happy accidents that managed to have a lucky, happy ending.
Great. Well, tell me more about MD Angels, how they work and what they focus on inside the healthcare space.
Sure. So MD Angels, as mentioned, is comprised of a group of physicians now really throughout the broader Midwest. So primarily focused in the Chicagoland and greater Chicagoland area, but now really extending out to Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, and Northwest Indiana. And we meet once a quarter and we look at healthcare deals. The way we structure the deals that we look at are really focused around all aspects of healthcare. So that can be health IT, medical devices, biotech, and early stage pharmaceuticals. We don't necessarily have one particular focus or the other. We really emphasize startups that have strong clinical fundamentals, either clinical studies already set or reference academic articles that can substantiate the value proposition. And based upon our multi-specialty approach to due diligence, meaning we have a primary care physician with a specialist, with a surgeon, all looking at the healthcare deals from a continuity of care perspective, we're really able to delve into the nuances of how a startup's value proposition can convert and materialize into a viable unit economic model.
So what do you look for in startups? What are the key criteria that makes them successful with your group, MD Angels, and yourself individually as far as investing?
Sure. So I think as a group comprised primarily of physicians, our success primarily lies in knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know. So we don't necessarily take the lead positions because we don't want to focus our energy on negotiating term sheets or focusing on more traditional metrics that a startup should emphasize. For example, competitive landscape, market size, market saturation, go-to-market strategy. We want those principles already established. What we want to focus on are the clinical principles, because having that focus, and we look at the startup companies, adds value to MD Angels, because other investors who are looking to syndicate or startups who are looking for clinical validation want to come to MD Angels because they know we are going to evaluate very rigorously the clinical basis behind their startup. So that's part one. Part two then is to really understand in very nuanced clinical terms, what is the value proposition? We discuss the clinical studies. We discuss and meet with the physician advisors, the physician founders of these startups, because we want to have that clinically oriented conversation around why this startup is going to add value. And then the third point, which should not be underestimated, is understanding how the value proposition converts into the unit economic model. So many startups have brilliant value propositions, brilliantly elaborate on how they can provide value in the clinical setting. But if you're not able to understand how your startup integrates into the healthcare economic structure, be it reimbursement structures, stakeholder input, and more subtle factors like workflow, mid-level staff optimization. All these factors then become big barriers to adoption and limit the value of the unit economic model despite having a very strong clinical value proposition. So I would say that we focus on those three metrics. Streamline the clinical context to the due diligence, understand the value proposition, and study the transition into a viable unit economic model.
So how is the healthcare industry evolving? Where do you see it going at this stage? Because you guys are right in the middle of that space, and a lot of investors are very interested in where it's going.
So I think that's a loaded question because healthcare is a very heavily regulated market. And in a market that's heavily regulated, the regulations define the market. So for all the clamor about changes and innovations taking place, the regulations have not moved as much as it would appear. So by that logic, one could say that healthcare is still in the position it was many years ago. But obviously that's not completely true because we see so many of these things going on. So how do you reconcile this perceived contradiction? Well, the way you look at it is understand what is the nature of healthcare evolution. So I think healthcare evolution is evolving rapidly in certain ways and not rapidly in other ways. So for example, health IT influx into healthcare is evolving far more rapidly than, let's say, medical device or biotech innovation. And I think that has a lot to do with the FDA looking at medical devices versus the FDA looking at health IT startups. So I think to really understand the evolution of healthcare, you have to see the trends in healthcare regulation and look at where the changes are most pronounced and where the opportunities lie based upon those changes.
It seems like a lot of the startups are focused around cost reduction, not just shifting costs in the space, but reducing the costs. Where do you see that playing into the regulatory landscape? Is regulations changing to try and reduce cost, or do you see it running separately from the cost reduction efforts?
I think that it's more of a coincidence than a causality that there are a lot of cost-oriented startups. I think regulatory bodies like the FDA focus more on the safety profile for the patient and the physician relationship to that startup. I think the reason why you see a lot of cost-oriented startups is because it's easy to understand cost and it's easy for investors to understand cost. Cost is a very tangible metric that you can define a unit economic principle around. Cost is X. With my startup, cost is Y. What is the delta between X and Y? That is the value gleaned. So it's a very straightforward model that you can create. And it's not easy, it's not hard to sell cost savings. And so I think the reason why you see cost, not just because it's apparent, but because the nature of people coming into healthcare startups. A lot of people come from diverse backgrounds. And so for them, their initial approach to understanding healthcare innovation comes from a cost-oriented perspective.
So cost reduction is one investment thesis for healthcare, and there's many others. For yourself, what is your primary investment thesis for this sector?
That's a great question. I don't know if I look at it in that metric. I know that there are many organizations that we actually work with, like the National Quality Forum, the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, that have the triple aims, the quadruple aims, and they look at quality, cost, access, and then satisfaction, depending on who you look at. I don't know if it's fair for a healthcare startup to look at innovation in those terms or look at their value proposition in those terms. I think it's more that you create a solid clinical value, and then you identify how that value would be implemented. And if it fits one of those four investment theses, then that's the model by which you implement your go-to-market strategy. So I think it's more about first creating the value and curating the value and then understanding how that value is most appropriately implemented within the healthcare landscape.
Do you have any startups you've invested in that fit that thesis of value proposition and value identification?
Yeah, so I think the latest company that we invested in was Radiant Oximetry. So that's a medical device startup out of the Fogarty Institute. We kind of jumped in on them pretty early, probably earlier than some of the more later stage Silicon Valley companies. This company, what they do is they develop fetal oximeters so they can test oxygen saturation rate
of fetuses while the mother is in labor. And that's a tool that can be used alongside fetal heart rate to determine whether the mother should proceed with a C-section or continue with labor. And the reason why that is a value add play as opposed to something that's cost-oriented or something more tangible, yet something we felt we could understand and wrap an investment thesis around, was based not on one simple correlate of adds value, this is the value, this is how we quantify it, but really around physician decision-making. And then we allowed the quality play, the cost orientation play, the patient satisfaction play to derivative to physician decision-making. So take this instrument, fetal oximetry, combine that with the existing instrument, fetal heart rate. How does that impact clinical decision-making for the physician's perspective? How does that change in decision-making impact care management for the patient? How does the change in care management impact the reimbursement structure, the deductible for the patient? And so we were able to then create from what seems to be a complicated value proposition into a relatively straightforward unit economic model for how hospitals should purchase this and the pricing strategy around why hospitals should purchase this based on centering around the key stakeholder of adoption, the physician, and studying physician decision-making. And so I think value, in kind of going back to your earlier point, value, cost, and even these other components, if it's seen from the context of how a stakeholder would value it, it then becomes natural and you can iterate very easily what would be then the investment thesis around that startup.
Well, we've already talked about the challenge of regulatory in this space, but what other challenges do you see startups having to face to succeed in finding value and presenting value to the user in the healthcare space?
Well, healthcare will always be a very difficult industry to succeed in. What I find to elude a lot of startups is understanding the true nature of insurance reimbursement and the true nature of hospital procurement. They're not glamorous parts of the revenue cycle or of the purchasing cycle for a startup, but they're arguably the most important aspects. So let's address them one by one, and I'll tell you what's so difficult to understand. So with payer reimbursements, insurance reimbursement, the problem is that insurance companies will claim they'll reimburse X amount for Y clinical service, but in practice, it's very different. Insurance companies have cost to charge ratios. They negotiate, and negotiate is a very nice way of putting it. They negotiate how much they'll pay per clinical service despite engaging into a contract where they've claimed certain costs for clinical services. So a lot of these companies will not consistently reimburse what they claim to be reimbursement services. Impacts the pro forma initial projection of a startup, which basically puts the startup in an unfair position of inadvertently overstating their revenue model. The second component is hospital procurement. Hospitals don't have a straightforward purchasing strategy. The problem with hospitals is that most of their budget for purchasing either capital goods, medical supplies, clinical service costs, what have you, are already budgeted out quarter by quarter or year by year. So the amount of flexibility hospitals have is really minimal. And you typically have a procurement officer that's more cost-oriented, that wants to show his or her superior, be it the chief financial officer or the vice president of clinical financial regulations, that, hey, look how much money I saved on this budget this quarter. Look how much money I saved on that budget that quarter. So the purchasing culture in hospitals is much more cost savings oriented and much more fixed than what people would like to believe. And so when people think, oh, a hospital would want to purchase it, of course they would, they're oversimplifying first amount of capital allocation hospitals will put into new products and new services. And then two, they're underestimating the dynamics of the hospital procurement officers and their focus on showing good quarterly budgets as opposed to making long-term value purchases.
Well, there's many sectors in healthcare. There's therapeutics, there's medical device, there's digital health, and there's other segments as well. Where do you see the immediate opportunities that startups should pursue or investors should consider, given the current landscape with regulatory reimbursement and hospital procurement? What do you think are the low-hanging fruit investors should consider?
That's a great question. Let me first explain my thought process, and then we can derive an answer based off of that thought process. I think the biggest play is to show a straightforward reimbursement model. So if you can show X clinical service, Y reimbursement, and show a certain level of consistency across payers in different regions and in different markets, then you have a pretty easily definable unit economic model. And if you're going to work backwards from that, what types of startups fit that play? It's primarily those that have a set CPT code or a set DRG code, and those are more diagnostics. And I think by that logic, if you want to show to investors a straightforward financial model, a straightforward ROI, you want to have as straightforward an insurance reimbursement structure as possible. And I think the diagnostics have a far more straightforward reimbursement structure than the therapeutics. Because the problem with therapeutics is that unless they fall in line with an existing CPT or an existing DRG or a CPT code, then you're going to have to wait for Medicare or some payer to create a reimbursement structure that they'll authenticate. And then the problem is a catch-22. If they already have a code assigned to reimburse, why do they need a different type of therapeutic? And then you would have to show indirect metrics like cost savings, additional value, provider satisfaction, patient satisfaction. And then you start to get into more convoluted ROI plays and more convoluted financial modeling, which may be successful and by no means would not be successful, but it becomes more difficult to create a straightforward unit economic play.
Well, good. I think I understand better where we're coming from on that. In the final minutes of our interview, what else should we cover that we haven't so far?
One thing I always wanted to emphasize, and I'm stating this out of personal experience from my career as a physician and now very much immersed into the startup and innovation space, I think that more people should get involved in healthcare that have unique backgrounds. A lot of times you'll see people who come from the corporate world, who come from a large medical device company or a large distribution company or insurance company and provide an idea for a startup and run with it. Those folks are business-minded to begin with, and they understand the nature of creating a company and all the difficulties and beauties that lie within it. I would challenge physicians, nurses, hospital administrators, those who are more risk-averse, but not necessarily less important in the healthcare stakeholder space, to be more involved in the healthcare startup space. I think that having different people involved, even if it's from an investment standpoint, having nurses involved as investors, having hospital administrators involved as investors, gives startups a lot of credibility. And once they're invested, they're more willing to learn about the startup, they're more willing to support the startup, and even start companies of their own. So I think the biggest challenge and the biggest issue that I like to address is getting more stakeholders to the table, getting people who are risk-averse and more clinically oriented to the table and participating in the startup innovation space, either as investors or entrepreneurs.
Oh, great. So how best for the audience to get back in touch with you?
Well, I think the best way to get a hold of us and all the physicians involved with MD Angels is to just send us a straight email. And we can be reached very easily at info@mdangels.net. That's INFO @ANGEL at MDAngels, MDANGEL.net. So info@mdangels.net, and somebody will respond to you relatively quickly.
Great. We'll put that in the show notes along with your LinkedIn profile, and people will have the chance to get back in touch with you. Thank you for taking time to join us today, and appreciate the insights in investing in the healthcare space, and hope to have you back for a follow-up interview soon.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I'll happy to help.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.